Niko Soininen. I'm a professor of law at University of Eastern Finland, and today I will be moderating this CrossGov event. And today's CrossGov webinar focuses on the coherence of EU policies from a source-to-sea perspective, namely the Water Framework Directive and Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and their implementation in Finland, Norway, and France. So some of the questions that we'll be covering today are: how are human activities and pressures managed along the source-to-sea interface? What role do EU policy frameworks play in ensuring coherence? And what insights can we gain from national level implementation? And what are some of the transferable lessons between the countries? Before kickstarting the program, I will briefly go through the contents of the program and our speakers for today. So first, as a kind of introductory lecture, we have Assistant Professor Suvi-Tuuli Puharinen from Maastricht University, who will give a brief introduction to the topic, discussing policy coherence in a source-to-sea context from the perspective of EU Water Framework Directive and Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And I think also giving a brief kind of introduction to the source-to-sea as a concept. Then we move on from this EU level to discuss the governance challenges that countries face in implementing the EU legal frameworks and policy frameworks in achieving the good status of marine and coastal waters. And there we have, as said, 3 country perspectives and speakers. First, we have Professor Antti Belinski from University of Eastern Finland, representing Finland. Then we have researcher Saskia Trubbach from Norwegian Institute for Water Research, representing Norway. And finally, we have Marine Policy and Resources Officer Laura Bastide from Action, representing France. So this country recap or examples will be followed by a brief reflection and Q&A. So please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section of this Teams meeting. And after this first block of the program focusing on the challenges concerning this source-to-sea approach and its implementation, we move to discuss the key governance mechanisms that the 3 countries use to address the challenges in achieving good status of marine and coastal waters, once again followed by 3 country presentations as in the previous part, and brief reflections and Q&A on the solutions. Without further ado, this is our program for today, so I now give the floor to you, Suvi-Tuuli.
Thank you so much, Niko. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to put my presentation so you can see it a little bit better. All right. So thank you very much, Niko, for introducing the webinar topic and also my presentation. As promised, I will give a brief overview of this concept of source-to-sea and its manifestation in EU legislation, predominantly in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the Water Framework Directive. So what do we mean when we talk about the source-to-sea approach? So basically, source-to-sea is a concept that tries to encapsulate the idea that the freshwaters and the marine environment are connected hydrologically, as well as forming ecological continuums, like ecological systems. And in order to effectively manage this continuum, we need to have management approaches that take holistic approaches to land-based pressures, to different dynamics in this continuum that affect the status of waters and also the pressures that then ultimately end up in the marine environment. For law and governance, the source-to-sea challenge is a little bit, at least a historical setting, as freshwaters and marine environment have been regulated under differentiated regimes and different policies, also different management units in administration quite often. In EU law, we have a situation where the main directives that govern, on the one hand, the freshwater management And then on the other hand, the marine environmental management, so the Water Framework Directive and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, they employ parallel approaches, like both of them try to put forward ecosystem-based approaches to water and marine management. And in that way, they already try to address different aspects of this source-to-sea continuum. Furthermore, with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, as many pressures to the marine environment come from land, the objective of that directive cannot be achieved without managing the pressures on land. So there's an inherent source-to-sea approach in that directive, but also in the joint framework of the Water Framework Directive and the MSFD. Well, what is the role then to policy coherence for source-to-sea approaches? Well, in order for law to effectively operationalize and steer towards source-to-sea management, there needs to be coherence between freshwater regimes and marine environmental regimes. And this coherence, it encompasses both substantive aspects as well as institutional and procedural aspects of the law and the policy. This does not necessarily mean that there would need to be a one single policy or absolute uniformity in the policies with regard to these three aspects. But instead, what we want to achieve, or what should be achieved, is that different legal frameworks or policies, they form a joint framework that is capable of encompassing and addressing the dynamics of the source-to-sea continuum in relation to key environmental pressures, and also steers and structures the further policy making and implementation according to this source-to-sea understanding in relevant contexts. Ultimately, this can boil down to specific aspects of the policies. So one important aspect is in relation to geographical coverage. So we want the whole source-to-sea continuum to be addressed by policies, and specific attention to be paid in the intersection points of freshwater and seawater regimes. Then, of course, we want coherence in objectives, so the policies are steering towards a similar direction in terms of the source-to-sea management. And related to this, we want the substantive legal obligation, deadlines, and exemptions be aligned, so that it is easier to form the joint ambition level, the legal norms, the legal objectives in this regard. And finally, we also want that the instruments for achieving the goals and the management frameworks are rather aligned in this source-to-sea continuum. Well, then if we assess the coherence for source-to-sea in the Water Framework Directive and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, we can see that the two regimes, they possess quite significant positive coherence features that help in fostering source-to-sea approach with the joint regime of these directives. So first of all, talking about the geographical continuum, we have that quite nicely in these directives. So the freshwaters that ultimately flow to the seas are covered by the Water Framework Directive. Then when we move to the intersection points, so coastal waters, we have there both directives become applicable. And then when we go to the marine environment, we have the MSFD looking at that perspective. This also means that we, with these two directives, it is possible to put forward an ecosystem-based management regime that recognizes different ecosystem and legal scales. So we have more refined scales of water bodies for assessing the impacts of projects, for instance. Then we have a river basin approach in the VFD. And then finally, we have the marine environmental perspective, like the broader perspective with the MSFD. Also, with these directives, we see that their objectives are mostly aligned. Of course, here we have a little bit of difference in their approaches, and also the fact that the MSFD came into force a little bit later. So we don't see absolute uniformity in the objectives. For instance, that can be seen that plastics or some other parts of pollution that is a problem in marine environment is not necessarily reflected in the WFD's objectives. But when it comes to key ecosystem dynamics like chemical pollution, nutrients, eutrophication, species migration, etc., these objectives are quite synergetic and quite nicely aligned with the source-to-sea dynamics. Also, in terms of measures, the MSFD especially makes a lot of references to the WFD. So there's a lot of potential to align the measures under both directives. And finally, also the management approaches. So river basin management under the Water Framework Directive and the marine strategies under the MSFD, the timelines for the procedural parts of this planning are quite nicely aligned in the directives. So there's a lot of potential for the directives to foster a coherent source-to-sea approach in the implementation. However, at the same time, the directives also display some challenges when it comes to coherence from this perspective. And the first, maybe the most obvious one, is the discrepancy in the timelines. So for the Water Framework Directive, the deadline that is now pursued with the coastal waters and freshwaters is 2027, whereas for the MSFD, the deadline for achieving good status was already in 2020. So of course, this creates a little bit ambiguity, like how this aligns if the freshwaters that carry the pressures in the marine environment are not supposed to be in good status before 27, whereas for the marine environment, the good status was already supposed to be achieved. Also, there's a discrepancy in the legal effects of the objective. So we know that for the Water Framework Directive, we have binding norms on new projects, such as offshore wind in the coastal waters or aquaculture situated in coastal waters or project in the freshwaters. But it is still rather unclear what are the legal obligations, like what is the nature of legal obligations to achieve good status, in fact, by the deadline. With the MSFD, the jury is still completely out on the legal effects on both regards. Also, the exemptions into the directives, both of them have a variety of different exemptions for member states to justify not meeting the objectives, and those are not explicitly aligned. They are not referenced in terms of one another. And then finally, as both of these instruments are directives, member states have the discretion to decide upon the institutional and administrative structures for implementation. And this might lead to more integrated settings for the implementation, but also less integrated settings, depending on what the choices of the member states have been in the national implementation process. But finally, and this is not only a matter of these directives, for effective source-to-sea ecosystem management, the environmental objectives, they should have a strong steering force on relevant sectors and activities that cause pressures on the environmental status, such as agriculture, industrial pollution stemming from land, water construction projects, etc. But however, as we also see through the case studies, we see that many sectoral policies that govern these pressure sectors, such as the common agricultural policy, energy, industrial policies, they are rather resistant to fully integrate environmental considerations in their core. So environmental considerations may have a little bit of an impact, kind of like on the outer ring of these policies, but we haven't yet seen that the objectives in the WFD and the MSFD would very fundamentally shape and steer the development of the pressures that is governed through these sectoral policies. But I'll leave the introduction to here. We will get more interesting and specific findings from the case study next. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Suvi-Tuuli. So it seems that at the EU policy and law level, source-to-sea is quite prevalent in the Water Framework Directive and Marine Strategy. They both are quite coherent between themselves, but then the question remains to how and to what extent does it then influence other, let's say, economic sectoral policies, mainly on land. And we will return to this question particularly later on in the webinar. Now, without further ado, we have first a question for the three country speakers, mainly like when we think about governing the source-to-sea continuum that Suvi-Tuuli explained, what governance challenges do countries face in achieving good status of marine and coastal waters? And I give first the floor to you, Antti, to discuss the challenges of the Finnish case study. I believe you're on mute, Antti, so if you can unmute yourself.
So sorry about that. Thank you, Nico. And thank you, Suvituli, for a really nice introduction that really gave a nice background for this presentation as well. So I'm going to discuss these issues from the perspective of Finland, and specifically the Finnish archipelago sea, and how then these governance challenges over there relate to achieving good status of marine and coastal waters. And in our case study, and we had another case study also in this CrossGov project, we were dealing with the Finnish archipelago and then also the Baltic Sea level. And specifically in the Finnish archipelago, eutrophication was our key environmental challenge in this project and in general. And climate change will further increase nutrient runoff and internal pressures related to eutrophication. Major contributors to total nutrient load are, first of all, agriculture, and you can see over there their contribution related to nitrogen load and phosphorus load. And you can see that especially when it comes to phosphorus load, agriculture really is a major contributor to eutrophication problem. Then there is natural leaching, and then point sources that used to play a key role over there, but their loading has been decreased dramatically over the decades, and it's quite sustainable level at quite sustainable level at the moment. Then when we discuss about governance system, obviously we have these Water Framework Directive and Marine Strategy Framework Directive-based river basin management plans and marine strategy in place. But then also at the Baltic Sea level, we have Helsinki Commission's Baltic Sea Action Plan under the Helsinki Convention on the protection of the Baltic Sea. And then we have national legislation and sectoral policies, including permitting system in Finland and the Finnish Common Agricultural Policy Plans. Then how about these concrete governance challenges for achieving good status in this archipelago sea areas? The main challenge is that we have a nutrient surplus in this archipelago sea basin, and manure and fertilizers are key causes for that. And as a background, there are different interests and methods of food production. There are strong property rights. There is maybe not that well functioning common agricultural policy system in Finland in that regard, that it would really pay attention to the good status objectives. When it comes to diffuse sources, namely agriculture, then river basin management plans and the marine strategy lack concrete means to achieve nutrient reduction targets that are set in those instruments. Then in agricultural policy, there is perhaps, based on research literature, there is overcompensation for environmental measures. Then there are challenges related to area-based support system and its sort of income support nature. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but I think you're moving the slide, but we're not seeing it because I think you need to set it in presentation mode. So we are stuck on the first slide.
Okay. Just a minute. Sorry about that. Okay, I try to do it again. Just a minute. Okay, how about now? I assume that it works now then.
Yes, we can see the second slide, but still not in presentation mode. But this mode is all right for proceeding.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, but I was discussing this Finnish Common Agricultural Plan, Common Agricultural Policy Plans, and their overcompensation related to environmental measures, and that it's based on this kind of area-based support model as CAP in general. Income support is a sort of key element over there, and there is rather payment for management practices than actual performance. And this results in the fact that there is a sort of lack of river basin and river and field specific approaches to nutrient management, although those sort of general level objectives are in place, but not sort of context specific objectives that would be directly related to the status of water bodies and then to the marine environment. Point source permit system basically works pretty well. Of course, there are certain shortcomings, such as the sort of unclear role of the objectives of the Marine Strategic Framework Directive, and then how really those environmental objectives of the Water Framework Directive affect existing activities. And all in all, there is a sort of lack of a combined and coherent approach to both point and diffuse sources then at the level of Archipelago Sea in Finland. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Antti. So things get a little bit trickier at the kind of country or member state level, in particular dealing with the kind of core issue, how to handle manure and how to translate these general objectives to water body specific objectives that would be integrated across sectors. How is it, Saskia, in Norway, the kind of challenge, governance challenge context?
Yes, can you see my screen now?
Yes, it's now in presenter mode. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. So I will be presenting about the Oslofjord in Norway that I've been conducting research on with my colleague Gunnar Sander. So to give a bit of background, so the Oslofjord is basically a coastal inlet, but it has a quite large catchment area that actually covers half of the Norwegian population. And this fjord is in an ecological crisis. And this is, for instance, visible through severe eutrophication, but also the collapse of demersal fish stocks, habitat loss and degradation. And basically all these challenges can be linked back to intense human activities over many decades that include overfishing, urbanization, but also pollution from this entire catchment area. And this is both runoff from agricultural land, but also discharges of untreated sewage. And the governance situation in Norway is that Norway is not part of the EU. And this means that the policy landscape is somehow mixed between EU and national policies. And so for the coast, you can see that Norway has implemented the Water Framework Directive, which is covering both the catchment, but also the coastal waters. Due to Norway's specific geography with fjords and islands, the baseline is actually situated quite far out at sea, which means that Norway has a very large coastal zone compared to other states that is managed by the Water Framework Directive that you can see here on the left-hand side. In the marine areas, instead of the MSFD, Norway has its own national ocean management plans, but these do not cover the coast. So that means that for the coastal areas like the Oslofjord, the Water Framework Directive is actually the only policy for managing coastal ecosystems and water quality, as well as the connections to the catchment. So what we've been trying to do in our research is to try to understand if the ecological challenges in the Oslofjord can be explained by systemic weaknesses that we have in the governance system. And indeed, we did find a few challenges. So the first challenge is what could be referred to as not seeing the forest for the trees problem. So the Water Framework Directive in Norway, it introduced integrated planning across the entire river basin. But the problem is that it's very much focused on like individual water bodies as the main unit of management. And it's the environmental status assessment of each water body that is driving the planning of policies and policy measures. And actually, Norway has 32,000 small water bodies, which is much more than any other European state. So it makes the system very fragmented. And the problem is that this somehow overlooks this cumulative impacts, which is the sum of pollution from a lot of small water bodies located upstream that are ending up in coastal waters. And this is a major challenge for the Oslofjord due to its large catchment area. And this is also relevant for nitrogen because nitrogen is a major driver of eutrophication in saltwater, but it's less a problem in freshwater upstream. And a consequence is that this narrow focus on water bodies means that measures to reduce nitrogen or other pollutants are not sufficiently addressed at the source, which is upstream. The next challenge is, and Suvitule has touched on that before, is the coordination challenge. So the Water Framework Directive has established cross-sectoral water management in Norway, but the river basin authorities, they only have a role to coordinate, but they don't receive any like additional funding and they don't have really power to steer the sectors. And this means that the designation, but also the implementation of measures to improve the water quality largely depends on the voluntarity of the sector authorities, causing very slow progress. A third problem is the narrow focus. So the Water Framework Directive is primarily designed for pollution in freshwater. And the indicators for assessing the ecological status in coastal waters only covers quite selected parts of the ecosystem. And for instance, fish, seabird, or marine mammals are excluded from this assessment. And since the status assessment is the baseline to identify policy measures, this means that this narrow focus inhibits broader policy action against all types of pressures in the coast. A last challenge is the sharp divide. So as I've shown previously on the map, Norway's large coastal zone is only covered by the Water Framework Directive. And unlike other European states that often have created somehow an overlap with their marine strategies in the coast, as Suvituli also has shown earlier, Norway has a very sharp divide to its broader and ecosystem-based ocean management plans that only apply outside of the baseline. And this divide is not only geographical, but it's also in terms of separate knowledge systems and it's separate assessments that are being prepared for the areas. And there's also no coordination in terms of identifying the relevant policy measures. So this leaves the picture where actually the coast is not really managed from source to sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. That's a great recap from Norway and lots of incoherence as I see it, despite the EU frameworks facilitating also coherent approaches. So the kind of view shifts there quite a bit. We'll come back to some of the comparative accounts in a bit, but in the meantime, I move over to you, Laura, to discuss the French Mediterranean Sea, please.
Thank you, Nico. I hope you can all see my screen. I will now give you a brief overview of the French management of the source-to-sea pressure on the sea. The coastal area, my case study focused on the French Mediterranean Sea, and this part of France has lots of challenges because it's a very high-pressured area. As you may know, rivers is the main source of plastic pollution. It has, in the Rhone River, there are about 900 particles of plastic going into the French Mediterranean Sea per second. 63% of coastal water bodies are subject to direct or diffuse inputs from pollutants. There are also pressures coming from the sea itself. It's a very high tourist area with lots of cruises going by there. And 27% of French good transports are land into the French Mediterranean ports. Finally, there is a high pressure coming from land. For example, 33% of land within the 500 meters of the sea is occupied by artificial lands, what means that there is cumulative pressure coming from these three different areas that impact the very small coastal area of the French Mediterranean Sea. I will now give you a brief info on how the French coastal area is managed. More specifically, for the French Mediterranean Sea, there is one maritime basin that you can see here, the blue one. There is also two hydrographic basins, so it means also two different planning documents and two RBMP, with a big hydrographic basin that is the one from the Rhone, that even goes from Switzerland, and that has a strong impact on the sea. And finally, there are three administrative land regions. This leads to having, in terms of governance, three different planning documents. The main one that governs the marine area is what we call the document stratégique de façade. It's the marine strategy. What is very specific to France is that MSFD and MSPD are gathered in the same document. So this unique document has effects. It aims at achieving the good ecological status of the marine environment, but also at managing the activities at sea. However, the coastal area is also impacted by the river basin management plan, more specifically for eutrophication and coastal chemical states. And finally, there is one specific document. As to be mentioned, the land has also strong impact on the coastal area. And in France, there is a planning document that manage the whole land per region. And this management document can also give rights, for example, to municipalities to manage activities at sea in the 0 to 300 meters coastal zone. And these documents, unlike the two previous ones, are not meant to achieve good environmental status, but economic developments. And this is one of the first challenges that is faced by the French Mediterranean to manage properly the French Mediterranean Sea to achieve good environmental status. And this leads also to having these three documents leads to have also many institutions being involved. Here it's a summary. There are many more that manage the sea. But for MSFD, it will be rather governed at the national scales with declination at the regional scale. But it's a very top way to manage the sea. Then the WFD is managed by the water agency. And finally, you have municipalities and land institutions that are also involved. And if the two first ones are quite often in coordinating for WFD and MSFD, the land institutions are not really involved in the discussion related to the sea. And that is another challenge. And I wanted to share with you another plan that is not in my program. I don't know why, but a thing that is very important is that it has a strong impact at the local level. Because, for example, for a municipality which has 500,000 inhabitants, which is quite common in the French Mediterranean Sea, it means for the person that is in charge of managing the marine environments to have to implement MSFD, WFD, RBMP's objective, the document stratégique de façade objectives, but also Natura 2000s, and the French specific legislation. And this can lead at a local level to discrepancies in the way of implementing the directives, but also in a certain way it has a negative impact on the marine managers, because they sometimes just give up into implementing the objectives of the policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So also based on your presentation, it's quite clear that the source to sea approach is really key and important across the case studies, but there seems to be a kind of emerging shared picture that it's quite fragmented, then the policy and legal landscape when we move to the country specific level. So if I then ask, like we move a little bit to the comparative discussion. So Norway pointed to the weaknesses of the Water Framework Directive, including weak authority and enforcement towards sector authorities, like agriculture and municipal waste treatment, and then the same could be for other sectoral authorities. Is this also experienced in other countries? And if yes, is it the fault of the Water Framework Directive design, or does it come from somewhere else? What do you think, Antti?
Well, I think it's partly true also in Finland, like I was discussing over there, that when it comes to these existing activities, it seems that in general, and especially after the Weser judgment, it's pretty clear, at least in Finland, that those environmental objectives of the Water Framework Directive are indeed binding in relation to new activities. But then we have point sources that are under our permitting system. We do not have such a system in relation to diffuse sources, and then this kind of combined approach that is included in the Water Framework Directive is really missing in our system. And then again, of course, when we discuss about these different objectives of EU law and those directives, also then Water Framework Directive objectives role in relation to reviewing existing activities, whatever activities, is pretty unclear in the Finnish context. And then, like also Suvi put it before, then the role of the objectives of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and their legal relevance is still very much unclear. But I would say that on the one hand, the objectives, environmental objectives of the Water Framework Directive has become binding and sort of strong in Finland, but then on the other hand, this kind of combined approach and their sort of overall steering role in our governance system is largely missing, I would say so.
That's a good point. So WFD objectives and requirements really strong regulating point sources and specifically new projects, but then when we expand the picture to diffuse pollution and these cumulative impacts, there the challenge is very prevalent. Would this yes, Antti?
If I may just very quickly add that especially when it comes to agricultural policy then and some policies related to different activities, it seems that they are not very context specific when it comes to the status of waters that are recipients of these specific activities. So, for instance, agricultural policy in Finland, it's more or less, it is applied the same way in different areas, regardless of the status of waters.
Absolutely. Thanks, Antti. Really briefly, Laura, does this also resonate with the French situation that when we look at the cumulative impacts, the kind of steering force of the Water Framework Directive is relatively weak, and there would be need for measures that could steer the economic activities that are creating those impacts?
I wouldn't completely blame the WFD. I think there are very positive ways, things that are implemented, and we'll show a bit more in the second part of this webinar. But Regarding pressures at sea, WFD is not the most, I don't think it's the main tool. MSFD has a stronger effect, and also it's also due in the French context to the fact that institutions implementing the MSFD has a stronger power at sea and on the coastal area than the water agency. Water agency has rather it has a strong control on the input from rivers, but when it comes to this last part, when to this last coastal part, SFD and the marine institution have stronger power.
Thanks, Laura. Saskia, do you want to reflect from the kind of Norwegian perspective? How do the different country perspective resonate with Norway? I tend to see quite a bit of similarities despite the different geographical context and a little bit the challenges too, but also similarities in the challenge context.
Yeah, I think definitely in terms of like the weakness of the Water Framework Directive to achieve the objectives, that seems to be shared by the other countries as well. And then there's a bit the question, like, how does this relate to the EU and the way the directive has been designed, and what of this can be attributed to the national transposition and implementation of the directive? Because it's a minimum directive, so the countries are a bit free to design additional measures and systems, how it should be implemented. But I think that even though the objectives of the Water Framework Directive are binding, the problem is really that they are binding on this level of water bodies, and this somehow misses this whole catchment perspective. So I'm interested to see in the next part of the presentations how other countries might have solved this issue as well.
Super. Thank you, Saskia. So without further ado, let's move on to the second block of the program, discussing what institutional and governance mechanisms do the three countries employ to enhance coherence along the source-to-sea continuum. So over to you again, Antti, on the Finnish case study.
Thank you, Nico, and I try to share my slide. Again, just a minute. I wasn't that successful last time, but let's see how about now. Can you see it on the presentation mode now?
We can see the slide, but not in the presentation mode. But if you just have the one slide,
okay.
this is sufficient, I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry about this. I don't know why it's not showing in the presentation mode. Right, and if I may just add very briefly that I think that the sort of cause of this ineffectiveness, it's partly stemming from EU law and then partly from national implementation. Of course, EU law provides this kind of rather comprehensive objectives related to the status of waters, but at the same time, it doesn't provide very clear guidelines how to implement them in relation to different activities at the member state level. And I think that many member states are facing challenges in this regard. But now I'm going to discuss just a few words about governance mechanisms, how this coherence could be enhanced along the source-to-sea continuum in the Finnish context, and what kind of sort of good examples we could find from our system. So first of all, when it comes to policy objectives and responsibilities, those different planning instruments, river basin management plans, marine strategy, and Baltic Sea action plan, they all have aligned objectives in relation to good status. They also overlap partly when it comes to geographical areas, especially coastal waters, some indicators and assessment perspectives and so on, and those objectives in the end related to the reduction of nutrient loads and purification are very much aligned between those planning instruments. Also, agricultural policy refers to the water and marine good status objectives, and the same regional authorities in Finland play a key role in both water and marine governance. So at the level of sort of abstract policy objectives and responsibilities, I think that our system is actually rather coherent in Finland when it comes to the governance of the source to sea continuum. Then we enter into those challenges that were discussed before about their concrete meaning and concrete measures really to implement these perspectives. And then another interesting example in our system and in this Baltic Sea Action Plan and marine strategy is this kind of nutrient input reduction scheme that includes maximum allowable nutrient inputs and nutrient ceilings in the Baltic Sea sub-basins, and also in the marine strategy, it has been assessed that what would be this kind of maximum allowable nutrient input in the archipelago sea. But then again, obviously, its implementation at river basin water body level is a necessary next step. And then when it comes to these different planning instruments, then river basin management plans are the only plans of these three that really can sort of plan and then affect those land-based sources. Then we have certain emerging solutions and governance supporting schemes or systems for those solutions in Finland, and especially also in the archipelago sea basin area. First of all, concerning our permitting system of point sources, then when animal shelters are permitted, there are nowadays some manure spreading requirements included over there related, for instance, this level of phosphorus on the specific field and some requirements to follow those levels when spreading manure to specific fields. Then there is a support system in water governance, marine governance concerning gypsum spreading on the fields that prevents this kind of nitrogen and phosphorus runoff from those fields, and especially in this archipelago sea basin area. And then there are certain initiatives for manure treatment and biogas production, and the idea would be that we could sort of prevent or at least decrease this nutrient surplus within this archipelago sea basin through producing, for instance, this kind of organic fertilizers that then could be also moved to other parts of Finland and perhaps abroad as well. So I think that there are, at different levels, there are certain governance mechanisms in place that also enhance coherence within this Finnish and archipelago sea context, and maybe those are examples that could be useful also for some other parts of Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Antti. I think it's interesting. There's a nice suite of measures tackling incoherence, from technical like gypsum treatment to kind of governance mechanisms like supporting these manure treatment initiatives and maximum allowable nutrient inputs. How about the Norwegian situation, Saskia? How has Norway tried to address these incoherence challenges that you presented on?
Yes, let me share the screen. You can see it now, right? From the current slide.
Yes, not in presenter mode, but
I'll try again.
now it's in presenter mode. Yes.
Great. Okay. So, I mean, as I've been presenting earlier, in the Norwegian case, we observe somehow a mismatch because the Water Framework Directive is primarily designed for freshwater systems, but Norway's governance approach is using this directive to manage large coastal areas without using its marine strategy. So that somehow creates a governance gap in the coast. And this challenge is increasingly being recognized, and we do observe two a bit complementary approaches in Norway to strive towards more holistic water management. So the first one can be described as trying to improve the underlying system and the coherence, while the second one is to introduce a new layer into the governance system to improve the coherence. And I will explain that a bit more in detail now. So about the underlying system. So Norwegian governance is traditionally sector-based. But with the introduction of river basin management, stronger cross-sectoral coordination has been established. And over time, this has led to changes within the sector policy and the decision-making structures of the sectors, so that they are reducing their negative effects on the water quality. And examples for this include, for instance, introduced regulations, but also guidelines or subsidies that support the implementation of relevant policy measures. And these changes in the existing structures are happening gradually and over time, but they increase the coherence between water management and the sector policies. Another pathway is to improve the current system is to work directly on the river basin management planning system itself. So as I have mentioned earlier, a problem is that the current coastal indicators do not provide a complete picture of the challenges in the coast. And so there are discussions at the national level ongoing on whether to expand these indicators so that they better actually reflect the challenges in the coast. And this would make the Water Framework Directive more suitable for the area that it covers, which is the coast. But in parallel to these approaches, we also see another interesting policy process in the Oslofjord region, which is the introduction of a new layer. So in 2021, the national government introduced an Oslofjord action plan. And so this is a plan that is cross-sectoral, and it's integrating various sectors and pressures, both from land and from sea. And so this can somehow be seen as a new layer that is interacting with the underlying system. And we have evidence that it has both strengthened the implementation of river basin management plans, but it's also causing changes directly in the sectoral structures to improve their effect on water quality. And so I think the key points about this plan that could be mentioned is that the plan really has a very strong political mobilization. So it's led by the government, and there's also been established a council that ensures representation among sectors and governance levels. And this is relevant because compared to the river basin management plans that are very technical, this Oslofjord plan really drives political mobilization. And this has also been important to increase the societal awareness and really this fostered understanding that action across the entire catchment is needed to restore the fjord. And through this, the Oslofjord plan has also contributed to gradually shifting the focus of management from the level of individual water bodies to seeing the Oslofjord as the object that needs to be managed. And so it's somehow like addressing this weakness in the river basin management plans that only look on like these small water bodies. The Oslofjord plan has also mobilized financial resources, which are supporting the implementation of policy measures in the Oslofjord region. For example, earmarked subsidies in the agricultural sector. And another important point is that the plan really acknowledges that the environmental issues that are in the coast are combined pressures from land and from sea, and that they need to be addressed in an integrated manner. So one example is fisheries management. So fisheries is not addressed by the river basin management plans, and the ocean management plans only apply outside of the sea, of the baseline. But following the adoption of the Oslofjord plan, there have been more discussions about the role of fisheries in the Oslofjord, and recently large no-take zones have been adopted in the fjord. And so this plan also bridges a bit this gap and this sharp divide that existed between river and ocean management in the Oslofjord. So in general, we do see a lot of momentum with the Oslofjord plan. It's a lot of political mobilization. It's increasing the focus on the Oslofjord, and it has improved coherence. But still, we see challenges in implementation. So challenges remain, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you, Saskia. That's a really interesting development that there's another kind of national integrated plan on top of the WFD river basin management plan, seeking to tackle some of the insufficiencies and inefficiencies there. Yeah, thank you. Then we move on to France. Please, Laura, how is the situation there?
Yes. Can you see my screen? Yeah, I hope so.
Yes.
Just to cover some successes, I decided to focus on the coherence between MSFD and WFD and their related planning documents, because it's something that works pretty well in France. There is still the question that remains that were previously mentioned about the sectors and how agriculture and, for example, land policy or plastic pollution can be integrated. But there were, I couldn't find any very inspiring example from France, so I decided just to focus on these two ones. Historically, in France, Airbnb has been covering the marine environment until 2012 and the first implementation of MSFD. And when, especially for chemicals and eutrophication, when MSFD and later MSPD were implemented, France decided to have this document stratégique de façade, the marine strategy, that would only cover what was not already covered by the river basin management plan. So technically, until today, chemical states and eutrophication is still covered by the Airbnb. And there is a strong relation because the data is collected by the water agency. They are the one acting to limit limit this pollution, and then they use this data. They use their funding to then support MSFD implementation. To facilitate the coherence between these two policy documents, there are many stages where these policies have common mechanisms. First, during the drafting of these two policies, they have mandatory assessments between these two when they are drafted. Then there is an involvement of the water agency, but also of the marine state services when the objective of each planning documents are decided. Then, when the policies and plans are implemented, they have strong governance mechanisms. They have each year 2 meetings, one that is strategic to the whole Mediterranean Sea, with a bit more than 50 actors, including land services, to decide what are the strategic issues to be covered during the year for the marine, the Mediterranean Sea. And then 1 to 2 technical meetings between the two institutions implementing the Airbnb and the marine strategy, to be sure that their priorities, their funds, that what they do are coherent. To facilitate this coherence, there are also freshwater coastal committee that was implemented to be sure that coastal municipalities do not contaminate the environment with sewage, that they are aware that they impact the marine environment. And finally, the water agency has a dedicated service to marine topic, and that try to really create this link between the freshwater inputs, sewage, agriculture, contamination, and the marine environment. They also have common implementation tools such as common fundings, for example, on marine restoration or to limit contamination, but also mutually supportive program of measure. If you read each one of the planning document program of measure, you will see in each for each action how it supports exactly the program of measure of the other planning documents. And finally, they took some time to develop a common knowledge system. They now have a data platform in common, shared indicator, and scientific assessments that they share to be sure that they will achieve a good environmental status for each one of the planning document and policy objective. And just if I have 1 more minute, I just wanted to share two mechanisms that are important for me, because I really like to work on the local stage, but At the local stage, for example, if you take a small municipality, as I mentioned earlier, there are some incoherencies because it's difficult to implement all these planning documents. But two recent mechanism has been implemented to support the integration of land sea pressure. These two one are complementaries, and they aim at integrating in one local planning documents agriculture pollution, sewage, but also pollution coming, for example, from ports and activities at sea, everything in one document that is managed by the municipality, but with support from three institutions, the one from sea management, the one from water management, and the one from land management. This in order to achieve coherence between all these policies. And I don't know how what will be the impact of these two documents because it's very recent, but I think it's a good lead to achieve coherence between policies.
Thank you, Laura. So it seems to me that there's a lot of procedural and also institutional mechanisms for improving coherence at play in France. And looking at all the examples, I think it becomes really clear that for the need to increase coherence between Water Framework Directive and Marine Strategy Framework Directive and their instruments on the one hand, and between them and the different sectoral and economic policies on the other. And I think these national examples also have given some really nice food for thought also for comparisons going forward. Now, in the interest of time, we won't go any more into comparative discussions between the speakers. So at this point, I would like to warmly thank all the speakers for their really nice presentations, and also warm thanks to the audience for attending the event. Over and out. Have a nice day.